this in 2020 and pleased to have it here on the schedule again in 2021. So we'd like to invite Tracee Auld to come up and speak about sustainability, a topic that everyone is aware is playing out in a whole different range of approaches and solutions in the marketplace. And Tracee, maybe that's one of the issues, that there are so many different ranges and approaches. Welcome, please join us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Old. I am Chief Sustainability Officer, as well as I lead strategy for Graham Packaging. If you aren't familiar with Graham Packaging, we are a rigid bottle manufacturer. I worked with the team, led the team to set up the sustainability program a number of years ago as we saw what was happening and that we really needed to get ahead of it. Just to give you a little bit more information about Graham, and then I'll kind of go into a lot of details on sustainability. It's one of my favorite topics, and the biggest issue I'll have here is probably sticking to time. So at Graham, we have a number of public goals. Our goals are very much tied in with some of the key drivers that I'm going to talk about today. So tied in with the retailers, tied in with the brands, tied in with consumers. And so our goals, which you're going to see, they're very kind of the more common goals that we see across the various industries, 100% recyclable, reusable, or compostable by 2025, 20% average PCR content, and we're actually we're looking to revise that. We have also got an energy reduction goal, 25% reduction in energy intensity by 2028. And a 30% greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2030. Now, these goals, as I go through this presentation, it's going to be very obvious where these goals have come from, how they tie in. Just a little bit more about Graham. This is mostly just to give myself street cred. Last year, so we have won awards for our sustainability initiatives, including last year, we were actually rated by a third-party independent company called Sustainalytics, who's rated over 13,000 companies on their ESG programs. We rated #1 in plastic, metal, and glass packaging, and #3 in all packaging of rated companies. We were in the top 2% of global companies. So outside of packaging. So for us, this is something that we do every day. It's something that's really important to us. All right. So now for everyone, what is driving sustainability? Where is it coming from, and where is it going to push everyone to? So driver #1 is legislation. And I've kind of bucketed this in terms of 3 key types of laws. So the first one is the PCR laws. So that's the post-consumer recycled material. So you've got 2 laws right now in the US that are really driving this. You've got California has a PCR law that basically is going to require recycled content from January in your bottles or in this. So that's more of the rigid plastic packaging. So beverage bottles require 15% PCR from January. Washington has just now enacted, a couple months ago, they've enacted an equivalent law. Their law is broader. So dairy was excluded from the California law. Dairy is included in the Washington law, although it's pushed out in terms of timing. So there's going to be a few more years to do that. One of the things that we also see in these laws, like right now, the California law is beverage bottles. The Washington law is broader. It's kind of going beyond that kind of smaller beverage market. But some of the draft laws, like Washington actually had food originally in the draft bill, and it got taken out. What I expect to absolutely see in the future is that not only that these types of laws are going to extend broader, and that they're going to start to be including food as well. So that is something to be on the lookout for. There are other states that have they're talking about bills. I know Jersey is looking at one. But the other key element, nobody's supply chain is, or very few people's supply chain is sophisticated enough to have state by state different packages. So effectively what this is going to mean is the strictest law is going to set it for the whole country. And we have seen this in non-food and beverage packaging. California has a PCR law from about 20 years ago that relates to the home care space, and that, all of our customers, it's a national standard effectively, but it's dictated by law in one state. The next type of law, this is actually a pretty recent development, although, we've seen a few variations of this throughout the years in terms of where states were going. Right now, California actually has a bill with the governor to sign. So this is not yet law, but absolutely expecting it to become so in the next couple of weeks. And what this is the chasing arrows. The pointer is the red. Yeah, the chasing arrows logo there that you see on the bottom of packages. You see that as, on different things, and it will either have like a number in it, but it will also perhaps say, please recycle, or recycle ready, or recyclable, or whatnot. California, because one of the things that is a big issue here in the US for sustainable products is really consumer information, consumer confusion, consumer misinformation. And what California says is that symbol says to consumers that that product is recyclable. And if it is not, and you can't prove that it is, you can't put that on your package anymore. From 2024, I think is when it's starting. So we're still evaluating this, but it is definitely, you're going to see more and more of this. Right now it's a little bit of the Wild West in terms of people either claiming something is recyclable and it might not be recyclable, or putting words like recycle ready, or, please recycle, that is considered misleading in California's eyes, because it indicates to a consumer that it is recyclable when it isn't necessarily recyclable. So I'll go into this recyclability, what it does mean, in a few slides. And the last type of law that we're kind of seeing more and more, Maine and Oregon are kind of leading the way here, is the EPR laws, so extended producer responsibility. And what those types of laws are doing is really they are seeking to put the true cost of managing the recycling streams and the waste streams onto the people who have the best ability to influence it. Basically, that's the brands. So as a packaging company, we do what our customers tell us to do. If they want to do something, we can have conversations to educate them, but at the end of the day, it's a brand's decision. And so these types of laws will end up effectively giving a tax on more packaging that is more difficult to recycle, because it's costing that county or that state money. They'll look to pass that on to the people who can make a different change. So this could influence packaging types in the future. If you're in a product that isn't necessarily recyclable, or it's not as easily recyclable, there's a higher cost to it, you could see a tax effectively coming through. The next key driver is of course the brand and retailer goals. The retailers, the likes of Walmart, leading the way. They've always been a pioneer really when it comes to sustainability, and have been not just their own goals and what they do in their private label, but what they encourage their suppliers to do. They're really leading the way in the development of these goals. But in the last few years, we've absolutely seen a lot of brands as well as more retailers coming down with certain goals. And those goals really fall into three buckets. So the first bucket which, you know, if you think back to the goals I told you that we have as a company, you'll see that there's a lot of similarities. So the first one is 100% recyclable, reusable, or compostable. A lot of people have that by 2025. Some brands are kind of extending that out to 2030. The 2025 date ties in with an organization called the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the global commitment. And what that is, there's over 400 companies that have signed this, and it's basically it's where this 100% recyclable, reusable, or compostable by 2025. When you sign up to that commitment, you're signing up to that goal. So of course we've signed up to that goal. The next goal that is very common is a less virgin plastic. And so that is either a less plastic or a more PCR. So that goal is becoming more common. We are also seeing a little bit of the bioresin, not to be confused with biodegradable. It is not the same thing. Bioresin is often recyclable, not compostable. And it basically, its source though is from a plant type material. So like a sugar cane or something like that, a bioresin. And then the last group of goals are brand new, the greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so I'll go into those a little bit later on as well. Consumers, of course, are the other key driver. Now, a few years ago, what I would tell you is that consumers wanted more sustainable packaging. They did not want to pay for it. Absolutely not. And so, you know, we as a company, we worked with customers who wanted, for example, bioresin. And we converted whole plants to bioresin. You know, they put the packaging out there. They did not, but of course it costs more. So, but they just didn't get the actual marketing benefit of using bioresin back 5 years ago, right? So 5 years ago, consumers, that wasn't really a priority element for them. You know, there's a lot of studies recently. This is just quoting some of the stuff coming out of a McKinsey study from last year, which is showing that actually that's starting to change. It doesn't mean that sustainability in terms of consumer choices is gone beyond price and brand loyalty. It's not, but it is starting to be something that is a consideration. They will in certain circumstances pay more, or they'll buy more of that product. Okay, so those kind of three groups of goals: recyclable, it's kind of the recyclability. You know, I said recyclable, reusable, or compostable. Just to kind of address reusable and compostable quite quickly. So compostable, a lot of, you know, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation goals of recyclable, reusable, compostable, a lot of brands have actually kind of, they don't really talk so much about compostable. And that is generally because there is not a really good system here in the US for compostable. That doesn't mean there's no system. There is industrial composters, absolutely, but you have laws working against you in terms of California, talking about something, you know, you have to pass certain standards, which are very difficult. And it can be considered misleading if a consumer can't just drop it in their backyard and that it's compostable in that circumstance versus it has to go to a specific industrial composting facility. So composting is not really the thing that people are focusing on. Reusable, that also, you know, I was listening to the gentleman that was just talking about the, you know, the consumers could bring back the bag to be filled with the juice. We are seeing that a little bit more. I would say that it is still very niche. We make reusable bottles as well, although none of them are purchased here in the US. We have a whole reusable bottle business, but it's overseas because it's a more accepted form of packaging there, where people will return their products. But you do see the likes of the Loop Initiative, certain, I call it the milkman model, where they'll bring your products, they'll take your bottles away, your containers away, clean them, refill them, bring them back. But it is still very, very small, very niche. But recyclable is really the thing that's kind of driving a lot of this, and this affects so many different types of products. So first thing what does recyclable mean? So I'll tell you right now that there is kind of a technical definition, and then there's a legal definition. So the technical definition, you can recycle anything if you throw enough money at it, anything. But that is not what recyclable means. And if you think about that new California law that's coming in and the whole recyclability, really what what everyone and how you tie in with recyclability is, how is it easily recycled? And can it be recycled in a cost-effective manner? That is what comes into bear when you think about how to define recyclability. So the Federal Trade Commission, through their greenwashing guides, they have kind of requirements for defining a claim of recyclability. And it basically comes down to 3 elements. 60% of the population must have access to facilities that are willing to take and recycle that material. And so, of course, I am a plastic person, so I know that in plastics, it's PET, HDPE, and PE film. Those are the only 3 plastics that meet that in the US. The other criteria, the recyclers must regularly take, process, and sell the material, and I'll get into kind of how you look at that, because that's a much more complicated analysis. And then the last one is the material must be regularly turned into a new product. So it can't just be shipped overseas. It must be you must be able to trace it through. Okay, so that second element of what is recyclable, this is where it gets complicated. So the APR is the Association of Plastic Recyclers. And the way that they think about it is they've got their design guidelines, and whether or not something is recyclable or not comes down to a number of criteria. The APR has 4 categories. So it's preferred, which means it's all good, it's recyclable. It needs testing, so we don't know yet. The third is it is recyclable, but with detrimental features, which basically means it is recycled widely, but it's not loved. And there's some barrier materials that impact that. And then the 4th category, of course, is not recyclable. Now, when you think about, like, from a plastic point of view, and this is also relevant to other materials. So this is not like, this might be the APR standards, but this sort of analysis and the analysis from the Federal Trade Commission applies to broader materials, and that California law applies across the board. It's not plastics, it's everything. So the first thing is just the resin. So PET, HDPE, PE film, that's all good. We know what fits in there. But then you have to look at all of these other elements. What's the barrier? Okay, so if it's EDOH, generally if you're lower than 5%, you're okay. If you're a different kind of barrier, a barrier in a PET bottle, those standards are really being figured out right now. There isn't a landing on those. Color, if you have an opaque or colored PET, not recyclable. Immediately not recyclable. With HDPE, obviously the colors are okay, unless it's black, which I'll go into in a second. Shape and size, closures, labels, so something like a pressure sensitive label is generally not considered recyclable. And then adhesives, so is the glue water soluble, those kinds of things. Now, all of these things, there's, how they basically define it is it going to stop, like, is it going to gum up the system as a recycler is trying to process it? So does it make it that they can't process it? So a PETG label is going to basically gum up a recycler. So they don't want it. They can't process it. But you also have something like a colored PET. That's fine from a processing side, but PET is valued for its transparency. You get a little bit of red colorant in a PET recycling batch, all of a sudden you don't have transparent, clear PET you can sell. So it's lowered the value for the recycler. The shape and size is more actually about the recycling when you collect in curbside. if it's not big enough, it's going to fall through the system and it'll end up as a contaminant in the cardboard. So all of these different things, there's reasons for it, but it's not all the same reasons as to why something would be or wouldn't be. But the biggest thing to also know is that if just one of your components is considered not recyclable, your whole package is not recyclable. So, you know, that's the way to, it's a whole product, whole package analysis. How to recycle labels. These are becoming more and more common. Retailers are absolutely requiring them on their private labels. And again, they're encouraging their suppliers to also put them on their own, very strongly encouraging them. How to recycle labels. What they are is a set of instructions to consumers to give it the best possible chance to be recycled. It is not a statement of something's recyclability. So, you know, it will, and you'll see here, empty and replace cap. You know, you might have some that say remove label, you know, and so you can overcome some of the issues on the recyclability analysis with a how to recycle label. So if you've got a label that's problematic, you can cover that with the how to recycle label by telling consumers to remove it. Okay, so there is a way to do that. But one of the issues, of course, is that it uses the chasing arrows. We've got this new California law coming in a few years, which requires proof of recyclability to be able to say, because often these say widely recyclable or checked locally or something. But if it's going to say widely recyclable, they're probably going to have to think about how they're going to deal with this new California law. These are some products that, and now this is generality, but these are some products that are generally not considered to be recyclable today, okay? And again, that's, we're thinking about the 60% threshold. And, you know, when we think about that California requirements, these products are going to be more challenged to prove that they can meet the threshold and that they are actually being recycled. Because it's not just a material advancement that needs to happen. Advancement with the recyclers needs to happen to overcome some of their issues in order to be able to overcome some of the problems. So multi-layer pouches. So monolayer is generally, if it's a single, you know, it depends on kind of what it is, but monolayer is much more likely to be recyclable. But once you start, it's really the multi-material pouches. If you start mixing materials, that is definitely a big problem because it can't, you know, they can't separate it in the recycling stream. It's the same with the and you know, I say multi-layer carton, but really what I mean is multi-material carton. So if you've got the, you know, the cardboard, the carton plus the metallized interior and a plastic liner, you know, you do have recyclers who are willing to recycle those products, but does it meet the threshold that 60% of the people have access to recyclers who are willing to recycle it and who do actually recycle it? So that will be a big threshold for them. The composite can, again, this is a mixed material. You've got a metal top, you've generally got a plastic liner, and you've got a corrugate, or not a corrugated, a carton insert as well. Carbon black, what this is so the recyclers sort using infrared sorters. Infrared cannot see black. So there has been a lot of developments in this space. The colorant suppliers have made a lot of advancements to be able to develop a carbon black that can be seen by infrared. So can be sorted, but of course it's more expensive. Colored or opaque PET, I talked about that. And then, you know, foam and PVC products are problematic as well. There's more, like even in the rigid space, polypropylene is currently, it does not meet the threshold of the 60%. It used to, it doesn't now. There is a wide industry push to work with recyclers to get them to take that material. And how they'll do that is basically creating a market to buy that recycled material. And so what we are seeing in terms of trends is really brands moving towards more easily recycled products. So they're taking out colorant, they're removing labels, they're switching pack types. We're definitely seeing that more and more. We see it even more. The labels are getting smaller, and in Europe, you're definitely starting to see certain label-less products where they're just kind of doing it directly in. PCR. So I talked about, reducing virgin plastic is another key thing. So, that can either be switching to a material that is also recyclable. The thing that always makes me cry is when I see someone switch from a recyclable product to a non-recyclable product because they think that that's the right thing to do because it has less plastic. And they're not necessarily considering the fact that they've basically just taken a perfectly recyclable PET product and switched it into something like a composite can that is not recyclable at all. But there are, one of the key things with, the trends towards seeing virgin plastic reduction, we are seeing consumers are more savvy than they were a couple of years ago and understanding that not all plastics are created equal, and that you have to look at certain plastics for what their actual traits are. That's not universal, but we're definitely seeing that. But the big thing with virgin plastic reduction, it's either lightweighting your products or it is inclusion of PCR. And so with that inclusion of PCR, you're definitely seeing certain issues that need to be overcome. You can see hazing, you can see a color variation when you're using a high level of rPET in the product. But there are ways to overcome that. Again, generally overcoming more means more money. And so that's, one of the other aspects of this is consumer education to help them understand what a slightly yellowed or a slightly brown tone means in a PET package. It means it probably has a lot higher content of rPET. So traditionally, I should do a time check. Am I all right? Okay. Traditionally, in recycling here, we have mechanical recycling. And so that is very limited in terms of its ability to use material, right? So all of this assessment about recyclability comes from the limitations of mechanical recycling. Things they can't process or that causes problems for them. Barriers will turn things yellow or brown. But now what we have coming, more and more is advanced recycling, which is the rebranding of chemical recycling. So the industry has definitely wanted to get away from that chemical sign. So within this is something that can overcome. It's not a replacement to mechanical recycling. It is complementary. It can deal with lower grade material. It can overcome colorants, it can overcome adhesives, it can overcome labels. There's a lot of things that advanced recycling can overcome, but it is still in its infancy, so it is going to take time. But right now, think of it as the PCR can either come from mechanical or it can come from advanced. One thing that that's important to understand about advanced, and so this is my lovely I try to explain this to people, but when you get advanced PCR, so when you get mechanical PCR and you get your bottle and it's got, your package and it's got 30% rPET, that's done by a segregation of supply. That batch has 30% actual PCR in it. With advanced recycling, it is not that way. What it is you are buying credits. You are buying PCR credits and virgin equivalent material. It is very different. And so just to kind of explain how it works. So obviously you get, your recycling stream. So again, it can be a lower grade material come into the advanced recyclers. And what they'll do, they'll run a variety of different processes like a depolymerization, pyrolysis, things like that. And they'll basically take that product and all the colorants and everything, take it right back down to the hydrocarbon form. So you're going to have some char that happens, and that's just the waste. So that's probably the colorant burning off or a label burning off. And then that, gets turned into a fuel or a gas or whatnot, like a tack oil, naphtha. And then that gets shipped to, and this is my lame sense of humor, the crackers. So these are the oil companies. And what they do is they combine it with virgin oil. They combine the oil or fuel coming from this source, and they are cracking that material together. And within that, they're going to produce a whole bunch of different products. But one of the products that they will produce is the relevant to, so they might produce a form of gasoline or whatnot that comes out of it, depending on what they're cracking. But effectively, what you are going to get is virgin material, virgin plastic, but what you will get is PCR credits. And those PCR credits, it's called on a mass balance basis. And so there has to be, in order for this to work, there has to be transparency. There has to be a system of tracking everything through all the multiple parties. And so that is where you get, like global certifiers, like a ISCC plus, for anyone that's like in pulp and paper. About 15 years ago, we went through this with the FSC certifications, kind of giving that legitimacy to where you're sourcing. ISCC Plus is basically doing this for recycled material in plastics. And what they're doing is they're making sure the correct processes are in place to ensure that when you say you're getting a credit for 30% RPET, you're actually getting that they're not double selling. You've bought a credit that is valued to the actual waste material. So it is very different though. Where's all the PCR coming from? So that is a question I get all the time. I get, how are these states are passing laws saying we have to put, by 2030, it's 50% PCR into certain products. Where are we going to get that from? And basically, this is my view, but basically what they're doing is that they are creating the market. They're creating the demand. The fact that it doesn't exist today, they're monetizing that waste in order to pull. And so that is where, from their viewpoint, that is where I think that that this is coming from in the future, is that they're effectively creating demand, which means that more people will process it. You are definitely seeing, I heard one of the gentlemen on the stage yesterday talking about sourcing RPET from overseas, and that is like one of the things that companies are also doing, like such as ours. We're making sure that not only are we looking at domestic supply, because but also international supply. In addition to that, because, the big brands who are going to have PCR in their products, they're working with, organizations like the Recycling Partnership, funding recycling programs. So they are trying to also drive it. And of course, you do have states that have the bottle bills. So those deposit systems, those, I think it's up to 10 or 11 states that have those. They're responsible for 80% of the PCR in the country. So think about that. So it might be, as somebody that comes from countries that do have these sorts of deposit systems already in place, it is a potential way to also encourage, bringing back the materials. And yeah, you are seeing it here in the US, where you get 80% coming from 10 states. With PCR, the other thing that we're seeing in terms of a trend is people using that to make a statement in relation to, additional environmental consciousness or social consciousness. And so social plastic and ocean-bound plastic. So what this is PCR that is generally sourced from developing nations where the plastic has fallen outside of the traditional waste system. So they might not have a waste system in place to collect it. And what they're doing is by having companies such as, as Graham buy PCR from these countries, we're setting up systems in these countries to collect and purchase the material. So again, it's creating a market, it's monetizing the waste, therefore it's encouraging people to pick it up. You know, and that helps as well from the, so, you know, one of the stats that you see about like plastic in the ocean, I think is it 90 or 95 is coming from, you know, I think it's 10 rivers. 90% is coming from, sourced from 10 rivers. And so, you know, establishing these recycling programs in places where plastic is more at risk of getting into the ocean. Things like ocean-bound plastic, which is these waste systems are set up within a certain number of miles from a waterway, so from a river or whatever, a few miles from a river. And basically, social plastic is the exact same thing, except it doesn't meet the waterway requirement. Okay, greenhouse gases. So, you know, I've talked to a lot of people about sustainability. A year and a half ago, nobody wanted to hear about carbon footprint. Nobody wanted to hear about greenhouse gases. That was not something that was a concern. Walmart did have a goal back then, but it just wasn't something. When I talked to brands, when I talked to other retailers, this was not something they were worried about. This has been a really big shift actually, since it tied very closely with COVID, which was really interesting, you know, for myself. It was really interesting to watch. It almost, and, you know, I don't know the direct, like what, you know, hit it all off, but if you remember when COVID happened and countries were shutting down for the first time, and you were starting to see photos of air quality differences of the before and the after. That is when I started to see the conversation about carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions. I think before that, it was almost something that was too, you know, that people didn't necessarily understand how to impact it. They didn't necessarily see how it was going to have an effect, making certain changes. And it was almost, it was just around that time that this started to become important to people, and they started to make these goals. So more retailers made goals, and a lot of brands started making goals. So yeah, I call it the new kid on the block. And tied with that very much is this life cycle assessment. So again, what you're seeing a lot across all packaging types, so not just plastics, all packaging types, is how do I truly evaluate my pack type from a you know, from a whole kind of carbon footprint and full life analysis, be that, you know, where is it being sourced from, the freight that goes into shipping the raw material, the production of that material. Then you have like the use and end of use gets taken into account in these life cycle assessments, so that people can get a whole picture of what does their packaging, what is it worth, I guess, from an environmental point of view. And so, you know, in that space, you will get certain types of packaging where they will win because they're in certain areas of being, say, recyclable, but something else has less material, so it might win from a freight perspective. You know, something like, you know, glass loses generally all round on an LCA. You know, whereas something like you know, a paper, you know, flexible, which might not be recyclable, but it might, you know, in terms of how light it is, it might win on that, you know, from a life cycle assessment point of view. But, you know, what you're seeing is now people are looking at, so let me look at the life cycle assessment. Let me see, is it actually recyclable as well? And on top of that, you know, how do I make sure that I'm at the lightest weight, highest recycled content in it? And so they're looking at those at packaging holistically. So this is very different. So when we established our sustainability program 3 years ago and put all these, you know, all these different things into place, you know, most of what I did back then was really just kind of making sure that people understood the facts. I would say that people are much more understanding of the facts now, and really looking at it in a holistic manner, and what is the kind of the science behind it? Like, what is actually happening versus just perception? You know, a few years ago, I was always having conversations about glass. I don't have to have those generally anymore. You know, people generally understand, you know, the consumer perception 3 years ago on glass versus now is very different. A lot more consumers are educated on different elements associated with packaging. And so, yeah, that is my presentation. And so I am happy to answer any questions.
I think we may have a few of those. Let's start. Anybody from the audience? So Tracy, one of the first comments that I made when you were coming up is that there are so many facets to this. And I have to say, I wasn't even myself tracking the PCR laws versus the EPR laws. So there's that element. Then you brought in the recycling or partnering for recycling partnership. Then we've got the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and we've got the greenhouse gases and the life cycle analysis, which looked like it was going to really have an impact, where you could say, hey, the greatest result could be that we don't use glass, even though it seems like that's a piece. How does the consumer and business try and understand that and get that message across? Yeah.
So for the consumer is at a serious disadvantage when it comes to sustainability and when it comes to packaging. You know, organizations such as How to Recycle, in a sense, that's what they were established for, to help educate the consumer on what to do. But, you know, here in this country, what we have is every county, city, state all has its own, you know, its own recycling system, which means that we don't have any sort of, you know, uniformity across the board, which means that consumers are going to continue to be confused in the current state. With these laws coming out, these laws will probably help standardize things, not by forcing people to kind of, I guess, not by forcing brands to adopt certain types of packaging, but more making it less attractive for them to stay in something that's harder to for them to process. And so, you know, those EPR laws, which effectively is taxing packaging that's more difficult to recycle, those are going to have an impact of, you know, basically breeding uniformity, because you're going to have more people going towards, you know, like in the plastic side, the PET, HDP, the monolayer film, and then, you know, just plain carton and aluminum. You know, I know that steel, I've heard Maine is actually considering it not favorably, even though it can be recycled. It's just, I'm guessing that it's because it costs more. But I think those are the things that are going to sort of impact both the brands and then the consumers. Once you start to get uniform packaging, and you know, you get more states that will not allow you to claim that something is recyclable, because right now it is very much the Wild West. I see so many, you know, organizations that will put something that I'll read it and it'll say, please recycle. And I know the product is not recyclable, but that's their way, because they're not saying it's recyclable. They're saying, please recycle. But it is misleading to consumers, and that's the stance that California. So I do see in the next few years, we're going to get uniformity, not because it's been dictated by kind of like, you got to be this, but it's just going to make, you know, certain types of packaging less attractive.
Were you surprised that EPR rules came in with some support from the consumer packaged goods firms? I mean, when Maine's passed, it was a surprise to see that Ellen MacArthur and some other groups had signed on to support EPR.
I think that, you know, a lot of the consumer goods companies, they know where this is all going. They see what is happening. And I think that them getting behind the EPR laws basically means that they've also got a chance to influence how it actually plays out. You know, and that is a key thing. If you've got regulators coming in and telling you what your packaging is going to be, and you know that that's coming, you're in a much better position to get in there and help the regulators actually understand what is needed. Because they do know, they absolutely do know. You know, it's basically the wrestle though between the marketing department, the packaging scientists, and you know, so that's kind of what. But in a sense, the packaging scientists within the brands are now being able. They've got a good reason to tell marketing, no, we can't do that anymore.
Yeah, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Questions from the audience? You surprised me with one thing on the how to recycle. I thought that was gaining some traction. I'm not an expert at it. Topically, I've been seeing it on more and more packages. And now if I understood, the California laws would say either they have to change what they're saying or what the...
So yeah, so How to Recycle does its own analysis of whether or not something is recyclable. Generally, that is tied with the APR and with the equivalent organizations in, say, you know, carton or, you know, or metal. And so that is usually where they are kind of basing their standards. However, not always. And I think that I do expect, so by the time the California law actually takes effect, which, you know, I think it's 2024, because like I said, it's just brand new. So don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure it's 2024. But by the time that actually comes out, what I'm expecting is that How to Recycle will realign its processes to match up with California and match up with all of these, where there's discrepancies today. And one of the discrepancies in plastic is on barriers, where, you know, you've got How to Recycle will not label it recyclable, even though APR says that it's recyclable. You know, that, so you have a discrepancy there. And it's not the only discrepancy, but I think that How to Recycle, because you're right, it is absolutely, like, it's got the support of the retailers. You know, we're absolutely seeing it more and more, and I think it's great. But they're going to probably have to come in line with this whole definition of recyclability. Yeah.
And any specific comments for the HPP audience relative to you should pay attention to?
Well, I would say that just the sustainable packaging in general, quite honestly, because if you think about, you know, your target markets with, you know, like some of your best, you know, attributes are clean label, no additives, preserving, like the people who are the consumers who are more in that camp, like I said, the consumer drivers of wanting the more sustainable packaging, they are much more likely to be your customers than somebody else's. And so I think it is really important that you know, if you're not in a form of sustainable packaging, that you do start to think about, how can I make this what I'm doing today? So if you have requirements that it means you can't switch, what is the steps I can take to make this as sustainable as possible? Because from a branding perspective, you know, you're going to want to make sure that your product is not going to be disadvantaged when all of these requirements around sustainability really start to bite from a legal perspective as well. So yeah, it is. And what, like, it is, and I know I went through a lot, and I get that this space is confusing. There is a lot of things that are kind of moving around as well. But quite honestly, a lot of organizations can help. You know, like there is the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. There are various groups. There is a lot of material out there. And if you find a product, it is difficult, because you will always find somebody who will tell you, well, that's bad, but mine is okay. You know, as these legal requirements come out, I think that is going to be harder. It's going to be harder for companies to claim, packaging companies to claim that their products are sustainable unless they've got proof. And so requiring LCAs, requiring evidence of recyclability, I think is going to become more common as well.
Good. Any last questions from the audience? Tracee, thank you very much for the presentation and bringing your expertise to us.